The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Staff Sergeant Marcus Hawk Rodriguez adjusted his scope for the 100th time that week. The Marine sniper training facility buzzed with the usual sounds of preparation, but today felt different. Today, the Marines were facing their most challenging qualification test yet. And failure wasn't just about losing face, it was about lives that could be lost in the field. Rodriguez had been a Marine sniper for 8 years, with 2 tours in Afghanistan under his belt. His hands were steady, his eye sharp, and his record nearly flawless. Nearly. The 3 targets positioned at 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters respectively had become his personal nemesis over the past month. Each target required a different wind calculation, elevation adjustment, and breathing technique. The challenge wasn't just hitting them, it was hitting all 3 within a 60-second window while accounting for changing wind conditions. "Another miss," muttered Corporal Jake Stevens, lowering his rifle with visible frustration. Stevens was one of the most promising young snipers in the unit. But like the others, he couldn't seem to master this particular challenge. The targets were designed to simulate a real-world scenario, where multiple enemy positions needed to be neutralized quickly and silently. The rangemaster, Gunnery Sergeant Williams, shook his head as he marked another failed attempt on his clipboard. That's 17 Marines today, and not one successful run. These targets are set up exactly like the ones you'll face in Syria next month. If you can't hit them here, how do you expect to protect your brothers out there? Behind them, almost unnoticed, a figure in faded work clothes swept the concrete walkway. Miguel Santos had been working maintenance at Camp Pendleton for 3 years. Most Marines barely acknowledged his presence, seeing him simply as part of the landscape, the quiet janitor who kept their facilities clean. What they didn't know was that Miguel had a story of his own, one that began long before he ever set foot on American soil. Miguel had grown up in the mountains of Guatemala, where his father taught him to hunt with an old rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. By age 12, Miguel could hit a running rabbit at 200 meters. By 16, he was providing meat for his entire village. The mountains had taught him patience, wind reading, and most importantly, how to see patterns that others missed. As he swept, Miguel observed the Marines' attempts with growing interest. He noticed how they fought against the wind instead of working with it. He saw them rush their breathing, trying to beat the clock rather than finding rhythm within the time limit. Most critically, he observed that they were treating each target as a separate challenge, instead of seeing the sequence as a single, flowing motion. "Santos," Gunnery Sergeant Williams called out during a break. "We need the range cleared for 20 minutes while we reset the equipment." Miguel nodded respectfully and began gathering his cleaning supplies. As he worked, Corporal Stevens approached him, frustration evident in his young face. "You watch us out here every day," Stevens said, not unkindly. "Ever shot a rifle before?" Miguel paused in his sweeping, considering his response carefully. His English, though accented, was clear and precise. "In my country, yes. Many years ago." Stevens laughed, but not mockingly. "Bet you couldn't do any worse than we're doing. We've had our best shooters out here for weeks, and nobody can nail all 3 targets in sequence." "The wind," Miguel said quietly. "It tells you when to shoot." "What do you mean?" Stevens asked, genuinely curious. Miguel pointed to the flags positioned at intervals down the range. "Your shooters, they watch the wind at their position. But the wind at 800 meters is different from wind at 1,000 meters. Different again at 1,200 meters. The flags, they show you the pattern. Wind moves in. How you say. Waves across the valley. Every few minutes, the wave creates a moment when all 3 distances have the same drift. That is your window." Stevens stared at the maintenance worker with new interest. "You can see that pattern?" "Aye. My father taught me to read the mountain winds. Here is similar. But," Miguel gestured toward the ocean visible in the distance, "the water wind makes it more complex. But still, there is pattern." Before Stevens could respond further, Gunnery Sergeant Williams returned with the other Marines. "All right, ladies, Let's get back to failing spectacularly. Rodriguez, you're up first. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez positioned himself behind the rifle, his jaw tight with determination. This would be his fourth attempt of the day, and each failure weighed heavier than the last. He had a reputation to maintain, and more importantly, his unit was depending on him to master this technique before deployment. Miguel continued his work, but his eyes remained on the flags. He had been watching for 3 days now, timing the wind patterns, noting how the coastal breeze interacted with the inland thermals. The pattern repeated every 7 to 8 minutes, creating a brief window where the wind velocity aligned across all 3 target distances. Rodriguez fired his first shot. Hit on the 800-meter target. Quickly adjusting for the 1,000-meter shot, he fired again. Miss. The wind had shifted just enough to push his bullet wide. Frustrated, he fired at the final target anyway. Another miss. Time, Williams called out. Next, one by one, the Marines attempted the challenge. Each brought their own style and technique, but none could read the wind patterns accurately enough to compensate for the changing conditions across the different distances. The morning wore on with failure after failure. During the lunch break, Miguel found himself alone on the range, finishing his cleaning duties. The wind flags hung limp in the still air, but he knew that would change soon. It always did around this time of day, as the coastal breeze began to pick up. He looked at the rifle left on the bench, then at the 3 targets in the distance. His hands remembered the weight of his father's old hunting rifle, the smooth action of the bolt, the gentle squeeze of the trigger. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes when 12-year-old Miguel brought down his first deer with a single, clean shot. But those days were gone. Now he was Miguel Santos, maintenance worker, invisible to most of the Marines he served. His past was a different country, a different life, and skills that no longer seemed to matter in his new world. The afternoon session began with renewed determination from the Marines, but the results remained the same. If anything, their frustration was making them less accurate, not more. Rodriguez had now failed 6 times, and even his legendary composure was beginning to crack. This is impossible, Stevens muttered after his 3rd failed attempt. Maybe the targets are set too far apart. Maybe the time limit is unrealistic. The distance and timing are based on actual combat scenarios, Williams replied grimly. Our intelligence suggests you'll face exactly this kind of shot placement in Syria. Multiple enemy snipers positioned at these exact ranges, and you'll have 1 minute to neutralize all 3 before they can call in your position. The weight of that reality settled over the Marines. This wasn't just training, it was preparation for a mission where failure meant death. Not just for them, but for their entire unit. Miguel watched from the periphery, noting how the stress was affecting their breathing, their stance, their ability to read the wind. He had seen this before. In his early days hunting with his father, the harder you tried to force the shot, the more elusive success became. As the day wound down, Gunnery Sergeant Williams gathered his Marines for debriefing. We'll continue tomorrow, but I'm not going to sugarcoat this. If we can't solve this challenge, we're looking at either canceling the mission or sending you in without this capability. Neither option is acceptable. The Marines began cleaning their weapons and packing their gear, the mood somber. Miguel resumed his sweeping, listening to their conversations about wind charts, ballistic calculations, and breathing techniques. They were approaching the problem like engineers, trying to solve it with mathematics and mechanical precision. Excuse me, a voice said behind him. Miguel turned to see Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approaching, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. You mentioned reading wind patterns earlier, Rodriguez said. I've been thinking about what you said, about the flags showing a wave pattern. Could you explain that more? Miguel leaned on his broom, considering his words carefully. In my village, we hunt in the canyon. Wind comes down from the mountains, but it bounces off the rocks, creates eddies and currents. You learn to see the whole canyon as one system, not separate pieces. Rodriguez nodded slowly. And you think this range works the same way? Similar. The ocean wind comes inland, meets the warm air rising from the valley. This creates a pattern. Every few minutes, The pattern aligns so that the wind drift is consistent across all three distances. Show me, Rodriguez said, surprising both of them. Miguel looked around nervously. The other Marines had left, and only Gunnery Sergeant Williams remained. Checking equipment near the firing line. I should finish cleaning. The gunny won't mind. Show me what you see. Miguel set down his broom and pointed toward the flags. Watch the flags at 200 meters, 600 meters, and 1,000 meters. See how the 200-meter flag hangs still, but the 600-meter flag moves slightly left, and the 1,000-meter flag pulls right? Rodriguez studied the flags carefully. Yeah, I see that. Now wait, Miguel said. In maybe 2 minutes, the pattern will change. They stood in silence, watching. Rodriguez found himself seeing the range differently, not as a series of individual target positions but as a single environment with interconnected wind patterns. After about 90 seconds, the flags began to shift. There, Miguel pointed. Now all three flags show similar drift. This is your window. Sides. Rodriguez stared at the flags, all now showing a gentle left drift. How long does the window last? 20, maybe 30 seconds. Then the pattern changes again. And this happens regularly? Every 7 or 8 minutes. The timing changes slightly with the temperature and humidity, but the pattern repeats. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. How do you know all this? Miguel hesitated, then decided on honesty. My father was a guide in the mountains. He taught me to read the wind, not as numbers, but as living thing. Wind has personality, has rhythm. You work with it, not against it. Would you be willing to teach this to my Marines? Miguel looked surprised. I am only maintenance worker. Your Marines, they are professionals. They would not listen to me. They'll listen if I tell them to, Rodriguez said firmly. And right now, we need all the help we can get. As they spoke, neither noticed Gunnery Sergeant Williams approaching from behind, having overheard the last part of their conversation. Williams had been a Marine for 22 years, and he had learned to recognize useful intelligence regardless of its source. Santos, Williams said, causing both men to turn. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez tells me you might have insights about reading wind on this range. Miguel shifted uncomfortably. I only observe, Gunnery Sergeant. I do not wish to interfere with training. Williams studied the quiet maintenance worker with new interest. Where did you serve? I did not serve in military, Gunnery Sergeant. But you've handled weapons before. Miguel nodded reluctantly. In Guatemala? Yes, for hunting. Williams was quiet for a moment, weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, Tomorrow morning, I want you here when training begins. We're going to try something different. My known. Gunnery Sergeant, I do not think. That's an order, Santos. Be here at 0800. As Williams walked away, Miguel and Rodriguez stood in the gathering dusk, both wondering what the next day would bring. The wind flags continued their dance, following patterns that Miguel could read like text on a page, patterns that might hold the key to solving a puzzle that had stumped some of the Marine Corps' finest marksmen. The sun set over Camp Pendleton, and Miguel gathered his cleaning supplies for the final time that day. Tomorrow, his role at the base would change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow, the invisible janitor would step into the light, carrying with him the wisdom of mountain winds and his father's patient teachings. The three impossible targets stood silent in the distance, waiting for someone who could finally understand their secret. Miguel arrived at the range 30 minutes before the scheduled training time, carrying a thermos of coffee his wife Maria had prepared. The early morning mist clung to the valley, and the wind flags hung motionless in the still air. He had barely slept, turning over in his mind what Gunnery Sergeant Williams might expect from him. Maria had been supportive, but worried when he told her about the previous day's conversation. Miguel, you are a good man. But these are professional soldiers. What if you embarrass yourself? What if they laugh? Then I go back to cleaning, and nothing changes, he had replied. But deep down, Miguel felt something stirring that had been dormant for years, the confidence his father had instilled in him during those long hunting trips in the Guatemalan highlands. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez arrived at 0745, surprised to find Miguel already there. Couldn't sleep either. Huh? Miguel smiled nervously. I wanted to watch the morning wind patterns. They are different from afternoon. Oh. Rodriguez poured himself coffee from his own thermos and joined Miguel in observing the flags. What do you see? Morning air is cooler, more stable. The patterns take longer to develop, but when they come, they last longer. Maybe 45 seconds instead of 30. As they watched, the other Marines began arriving. Corporal Stevens nodded to Miguel with a curious expression, while others seemed puzzled by the maintenance workers' presence at their training session. The mood was tense. Yesterday's failures weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Gunnery Sergeant Williams called the group to attention. Gentlemen, we're going to try something different today. Santos here has been observing our training and has insights about wind reading that might help us solve this problem. Several Marines exchanged glances, and Miguel could sense their skepticism. He didn't blame them. From their perspective, he was just the janitor, and they were elite soldiers facing a critical mission. With respect, Gunny, said Sergeant Patricia Chen. A sniper with 3 combat deployments. We've been working with meteorological data and ballistic computers. What can a civilian tell us that we don't already know? Williams nodded, acknowledging her concern. Fair question, Chen. But right now, our technology and training haven't solved this problem. I'm willing to try a different approach. Santos, explain what you told Rodriguez yesterday. Miguel stepped forward, acutely aware that all eyes were on him. His English, usually adequate for his maintenance duties, suddenly felt clumsy and insufficient. But then he looked at the flags beginning to stir in the early breeze, and his father's voice echoed in his memory. Mijo. The wind speaks to those who listen with patience and respect. Your computers and charts, Miguel began slowly. They tell you wind speed and direction at specific points. But wind is not, how you say, static. It flows like water in river. River has currents, eddies, places where water moves different speeds. He pointed toward the flags at various distances. You see each flag as separate measurement. But I see them as one system. The wind that affects your bullet at 800 meters started its journey at ocean. It picked up heat from land, bounced off buildings, mixed with cooler air in valley. By time it reaches 1,200 meters, it has changed many times. Corporal Stevens raised his hand. But how do you predict those changes? Our ballistic computers calculate drift based on multiple weather stations. Miguel walked toward the firing line, gesturing for them to follow. Computers calculate average conditions. But shooting happens in specific moment, not average moment. Watch. He positioned himself where he could see all the flags clearly, then began pointing them out in sequence. Flag at 200 meters shows base wind coming from ocean. Flag at 600 meters shows how wind reacts to hill behind it. Flag at 1,000 meters shows wind after it passes through valley. Usually, they all show different directions, different speeds. The Marines watched the flags, noting the chaotic differences in their movements. But, Miguel continued, every few minutes, the wind finds harmony, like orchestra tuning instruments. For short time, all flags show similar pattern. That is when you shoot all 3 targets. Sergeant Chen frowned. But the timing would have to be perfect. How do you know when this harmony will occur? Miguel smiled, remembering his father's lessons. You watch rhythm. Wind has rhythm like heartbeat, like breathing. In mountains, I learned to feel this rhythm. Here, I watch flags for 3 days. Pattern repeats every 7 to 8 minutes in afternoon, every 9 to 10 minutes in morning. Rodriguez stepped forward. Show us. Tell us when the next window will open. Miguel studied the flags carefully, noting the subtle changes in their movement. The morning air was still stabilizing, but he could sense the approaching alignment. Soon, maybe 3 minutes, you will see all flags show gentle drift to left. The Marines watched skeptically as Miguel counted down. 2 minutes, 90 seconds. Now watch flag at 600 meters. It begins to shift. 60 seconds. 30 seconds. There, as if orchestrated, all the flags along the range suddenly showed the same gentle leftward drift. The Marines stared in amazement at the synchronized movement. "How long will it last?" Williams asked. 45 seconds, maybe 50 in morning conditions, Miguel replied. Then pattern breaks apart, returns to chaos. True to his prediction, the flags began showing different directions again after about 47 seconds. "That's incredible," Stevens whispered. "But can you teach us to see it?" Miguel nodded. "Is not magic. Is observation and patience. In my village, children learn this for hunting. But you are Marines. You learn faster than children." Williams made a decision. "Rodriguez, you're first. Santos will call the wind window. When he says shoot, you engage all 3 targets in sequence." Rodriguez positioned himself behind the rifle, settling into his familiar stance. But instead of focusing solely on his scope, he found himself aware of the larger environment around him, the flags, the feel of the air, the rhythm Miguel had described. "Next window coming," Miguel announced, watching the flags. "Rodriguez, you breathe normal. Do not rush. When I say begin, you have 45 seconds for all 3 shots." The Marines watched tensely as the flags began their subtle shift toward alignment. Miguel's voice was calm and steady as he tracked the wind pattern. 30 seconds to window. 15 seconds. Flags beginning to align. "Get ready. Steady your breathing. Now." Rodriguez smoothly transitioned between targets, his movements flowing rather than hurried. His first shot struck the 800-meter target dead center. The second shot, adjusted for the consistent left drift, hit the 1,000-meter target. His third shot, taken with 15 seconds remaining in the window, found the 1,200-meter target perfectly. The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez had just accomplished what none of them had managed in weeks of trying. "Holy shit," Stevens breathed, then quickly added, "Sorry. Gunny." Williams was staring at the targets in disbelief. "Santos, do that again." "Chen, you're up." Sergeant Chen approached the rifle with a new respect for the quiet maintenance worker. Miguel repeated his wind reading, calling another window with precise timing. Chen, following the same approach of working with the wind pattern rather than fighting it, successfully engaged all 3 targets within the time limit. One by one, the Marines attempted the challenge under Miguel's guidance. Not all succeeded. Reading the wind patterns still required skill and practice, but 5 out of 8 Marines achieved what had been impossible the day before. During the lunch break, the atmosphere was electric with excitement. The Marines clustered around Miguel, asking questions about wind reading, hunting techniques, and his background in Guatemala. For the first time in 3 years, Miguel found himself the center of attention at Camp Pendleton. "Santos," Gunnery Sergeant Williams approached during the break, "I need to ask you something. Have you ever considered formal military training?" Miguel looked surprised. "I am 42 years old, Gunnery Sergeant. Too old for Marines. Not as a recruit, as a consultant. What you've shown us today, this could change how we train snipers. We've been so focused on technology that we forgot some skills can't be computed." Before Miguel could respond, Corporal Stevens joined them. "Miguel, where exactly did you learn to shoot in Guatemala?" Miguel hesitated, then decided these men deserved the truth. "My father was hunting guide for wealthy Americans and Europeans. But before that, during Civil War, he was, how you say, guerrilla fighter. He taught me everything. Hunting, tracking, shooting. Said knowledge should not die with him." The Marines exchanged looks. Guatemala's civil war had been brutal and complex, but they respected the skills it had produced in people like Miguel's father. "That explains a lot," Williams said thoughtfully. "Guerrilla fighters often develop techniques that conventional military doesn't teach. Field improvisation, environmental awareness, patience." The afternoon session proved even more successful. With Miguel's wind-reading guidance and their morning breakthrough, the Marines began developing their own ability to see the patterns. Rodriguez was teaching others the smooth transition technique between targets, while Miguel continued calling wind windows with remarkable accuracy. But it was Sergeant Chen who asked the critical question that would change everything. Miguel, if you can read these wind patterns so accurately, could you actually make these shots yourself? Miguel paused in his flag watching. I have not fired rifle in many years, Sergeant. My hands are older, my eyes not as sharp. But could you try? Stevens pressed. Just once. To show us the complete technique? Miguel looked at the rifle, then at the eager faces of the Marines. Part of him wanted to decline, to remain in his safe role as observer and advisor. But another part, the part that remembered his father's pride and the satisfaction of a perfect shot, stirred with old hunger. I could try, he said quietly. But if I miss, you must promise not to lose faith in the wind reading. The technique is sound. Even if I am not. Williams nodded. Fair enough, but something tells me you won't miss. Miguel approached the rifle with reverence, his hands remembering the familiar weight and balance. The stock felt different from his father's old hunting rifle, but the basics remained the same. He adjusted the scope to his eye, checked the action, and settled into a modified version of his father's hunting stance. The window comes in 4 minutes, he announced, surprising himself with how naturally the assessment came. I will show you complete technique breathing, timing, smooth transition between targets. The Marines gathered around, watching intently as Miguel demonstrated the proper breathing rhythm for wind shooting. You breathe with the wind pattern, he explained. Wind has pulse. You match your pulse to wind. As the crucial moment approached, Miguel felt a calmness descend over him that he hadn't experienced in years. The flags began their telltale shift toward alignment, and he could feel the rhythm his father had taught him decades ago in the Guatemalan highlands. Window opening, he called out, then smoothly transitioned into shooter mode. Beginning sequence. Now. His first shot was perfect, striking the 800-meter target with precision that impressed even the veteran Marines. The second shot followed in fluid motion, finding the 1,000-meter target exactly where the consistent wind drift predicted. For the third shot, Miguel paused briefly, feeling the wind pattern at its peak stability, then squeezed the trigger. The 1,200-meter target showed a perfect hit, but Miguel wasn't finished. As the Marines began to cheer, he held up his hand for silence and remained in position. Window still open for 15 seconds, he said calmly. Pattern is perfect today. Then, to the complete amazement of everyone watching, Miguel smoothly traversed back through all 3 targets in reverse order, placing a second shot in each target, with mechanical precision. When the wind window finally closed, he had placed 6 shots in 3 targets in under 45 seconds, each shot perfectly compensated for wind drift. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before erupting in cheers and applause. Miguel stood slowly, his hands steady but his heart racing with the thrill of perfect shooting. He had just demonstrated something that would become legendary at Camp Pendleton, the impossible made to look effortless. Williams stared at the targets, then at Miguel, then back at the targets. Santos, I need to make some phone calls. This changes everything. As word spread throughout the base, Miguel found himself in an entirely new position. The invisible janitor had become the most talked-about person at Camp Pendleton, but more importantly, he had proven that sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes from the most unexpected sources. The day ended with Miguel surrounded by Marines eager to learn more about his techniques. But as the sun set over the range, he thought about his father and the mountain winds of Guatemala. The old skills had found new purpose, and the quiet janitor had discovered that his knowledge could still make a difference in the world. Word of Miguel's demonstration reached Colonel James Harrison's office within 2 hours. Harrison, commanding officer of the sniper training program, had been receiving daily reports about his Marines' inability to master the 3-target sequence. The mission in Syria was scheduled to begin in 10 days, and failure was not an option. You're telling me a maintenance worker accomplished what our best snipers couldn't? Harrison asked Gunnery Sergeant Williams over the phone. Sir, not only did he make all 3 shots, but he did it twice in the same window. 6 perfect hits, in under 45 seconds, and he's teaching our Marines to read wind patterns that our meteorological equipment missed entirely. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Bring him to my office. Now. An hour later, Miguel found himself sitting across from Colonel Harrison, still wearing his work clothes and trying to process how dramatically his life had changed in a single day. William sat beside him while Harrison reviewed Miguel's personnel file. 3 years as maintenance staff, excellent performance reviews, no security issues, Harrison read aloud. But nothing here about military experience or advanced marksmanship training. Miguel shifted uncomfortably. Colonel, I learned to shoot as boy in Guatemala. Is not military training? Just hunting with my father. Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Santos, what you demonstrated today represents skills that could save American lives. I need to understand exactly what you can do and how we can use it. I can read wind patterns, Colonel. I can teach this to your Marines. But I am not soldier. No. But you might be something more valuable, a teacher with skills our regular instructors lack. Harrison paused, studying Miguel carefully. I'm going to make you an offer. We can arrange a temporary consultant position, good pay, proper clearance, official status. Your job would be training our snipers in environmental reading techniques. Miguel thought about Maria, about their small apartment, about the security of his maintenance job. What about my current work? Quote, you'd be promoted to a training specialist position. Better pay, better benefits, and the chance to use skills you probably never thought would matter again. Before Miguel could respond, Williams spoke up. Sir, there's something else. The mission in Syria. If we could get Santos cleared for deployment. As an advisor, Harrison held up his hand. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But Santos, I want you to spend the next week working exclusively with our Syria-bound unit. Teach them everything you can about wind reading and environmental awareness. Can you do that? Miguel nodded slowly. Yes, Colonel. I can teach them. The next 5 days transformed the sniper program at Camp Pendleton. Miguel worked with 24 Marines, teaching them to see wind patterns, read environmental cues, and develop what he called mountain patience, the ability to wait for perfect conditions rather than forcing imperfect shots. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez became his most eager student, quickly grasping the concepts and helping to translate Miguel's instinctive knowledge into teachable techniques. Sergeant Chen developed her own variation of Miguel's breathing rhythm, synchronizing her heartbeat with wind patterns. Even Corporal Stevens, the youngest of the group, began displaying an almost supernatural ability to predict wind windows. You cannot rush the wind, Miguel told them repeatedly. Wind has its own schedule. Your job is to be ready when wind is ready for you. But it was during the 4th day of intensive training that Miguel demonstrated something that would earn him a permanent place in Marine Corps legend. The training exercise involved engaging targets at varying elevations, while accounting for both wind drift and gravitational drop over distances up to 1,500 meters. The Marines had been struggling with a particular scenario, 3 targets positioned at different elevations on a hillside, simulating enemy positions in mountainous terrain. The wind patterns were complex, bouncing off the artificial hills and creating unpredictable eddies and currents. This is impossible, Sergeant Chen declared after her 7th failed attempt. The wind is different at every elevation, and it keeps changing as it hits the slopes. Miguel studied the setup carefully, noting how the artificial terrain created miniature weather patterns similar to the canyons of his childhood. In mountains, he said thoughtfully, wind behaves like water flowing downhill. It follows paths of least resistance, creates whirlpools behind obstacles. He pointed to specific areas of the artificial terrain. See how wind hits this slope, splits into 2 streams? One goes up and over, one flows around the base. They meet again behind the hill, create turbulence. But higher up, above the turbulence, wind flows smooth. Rodriguez nodded slowly. So the targets at different elevations are in completely different wind conditions? Exactly. And conditions change as terrain changes wind flow. But, Miguel smiled with remembered knowledge. Mountain winds have patterns too. Every few minutes, the pattern resets, creates moment of clarity across all elevations. To demonstrate, Miguel took position behind the rifle and began his assessment routine. But this time, instead of just watching flags, he studied the artificial terrain like a topographical map, visualizing how the wind would behave as it encountered each slope and valley. The Marines watched in fascination as Miguel began calling out wind conditions at different elevations. Target 1. Low position, wind coming up the slope, add 2 clicks left. Target 2. Middle elevation. Wind flowing around hill, add 1 click right. Target 3. High position. Above turbulence zone. Wind clean and steady. No adjustment needed. But when do we shoot? Stevens asked. The conditions are all different. Now you wait. Miguel replied calmly. Pattern is building. In 90 seconds, thermal current will create upslope wind that equalizes all 3 positions. That is your window. True to his prediction, the complex wind patterns suddenly simplified as a thermal updraft created consistent conditions across all 3 target elevations. Miguel smoothly engaged all 3 targets in sequence, placing perfect shots despite the challenging angles and distances. But what happened next cemented his reputation forever. As the Marines applauded, Miguel remained in position. Wind pattern not finished, he announced. Thermal creates second window in 45 seconds. Pattern will reverse, creating downdraft with opposite conditions. The Marines watched in amazement as Miguel waited patiently, reading wind cues they couldn't even detect. When the moment came, he smoothly adjusted his aim points and engaged all 3 targets again, this time compensating for completely different wind conditions. 6 shots, 3 targets, 2 different wind patterns. All within a 3-minute period. It was shooting that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. How is that possible? Chen whispered. Miguel finally stood, his expression thoughtful. Is not magic. Is reading the whole system, not just parts. Mountain wind teaches you to see how everything connects: terrain, temperature, pressure, humidity. All pieces of same puzzle. Colonel Harrison, who had been quietly observing the demonstration, stepped forward. Santos, I've made my decision. I want you on the Syria mission. Miguel's eyes widened. Colonel, I am not soldier. I have no combat training. No, you won't be in combat. You'll be stationed at our forward observation post, reading wind conditions for our sniper teams. What you just demonstrated could be the difference between mission success and failure. That evening, Miguel called Maria from the base phone. Explaining the opportunity was difficult. How do you tell your wife that your quiet maintenance job had suddenly become something that could take you to a war zone? Miguel, this is not your war, Maria said, her voice heavy with worry. No, mi amor. But these young Marines, they are going whether I help them or not. If my knowledge can bring them home safe, how can I not share it? Maria was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, your father would be proud. Go teach them what he taught you. The final 2 days of training were intensive preparation for deployment. Miguel worked with the Syria-bound unit on reading wind patterns in desert conditions, adapting his mountain knowledge to different terrain and climate. More importantly, he taught them something his father had called respectful shooting. The understanding that taking a life, even an enemy's life, required perfect preparation and absolute certainty. In mountains, we never wasted shots, he told them. Every bullet was precious. Every shot had to count. You approach enemy the same way. You wait for perfect moment. You make shot count. You honor the seriousness of what you do. The Marines listened with respect that had been earned through demonstration rather than rank. Miguel was no longer the invisible janitor. He had become their teacher, their guide into a world of shooting that few had ever imagined possible. On the final day before deployment, Miguel stood on the range one last time with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. The 3 targets that had once seemed impossible now appeared almost routine after a week of intensive training. Think the skills will transfer to real combat conditions? Rodriguez asked. Miguel watched the flags dancing in the afternoon breeze, reading patterns that had become as clear as text on a page. Wind is wind, distance is distance. What changes is pressure you feel to perform. That is where mountain patience becomes most important. Rodriguez nodded, understanding. Thank you, Miguel. You've given us something we never knew we needed. The next morning, Miguel found himself on a military transport plane, flying toward Syria with a unit of Marines, who now saw him not as support staff, but as an essential part of their mission. He carried with him his father's teachings, adapted for modern warfare, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important skills come from the most unexpected places. As the plane flew through clouds over the Atlantic, Miguel thought about the strange journey that had brought him from the mountains of Guatemala to advising United States Marines. His father's voice seemed to whisper in the engine noise. Mijo. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Teach them well. The quiet janitor was now heading to war, not as a soldier, but as something perhaps more valuable, a teacher whose insights could mean the difference between life and death for the young Marines who had become his students. The 3 impossible targets had been just the beginning of a story that would reshape how the Marine Corps understood the art of precision shooting. In Syria, Miguel Santos would have the opportunity to prove that his father's mountain wisdom could save lives on a modern battlefield, and that sometimes the most crucial skills are carried by those who seem most invisible to the world around them.